All right, hey everybody, God bless you guys in Jesus' name. Today in this video, I wanted to talk about a post actually that I saw recently. Doesn't really have anything to do particularly with that post, but in this post, one of my Facebook friends was saying that if a church doesn't believe or a pastor doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon, that you should leave that church. And I view that as a very black and white statement, even coming from a deliverance minister. I view that as a very binary type statement. There's no depth to the conversation then, right? Obviously, there could be depth to the conversation in some cases, but if you just take a hardline stance of like, if the pastor doesn't directly totally affirm a Christian can have a demon, you should leave that church. That's kind of saying that that church is no good. That's kind of saying that that church is maybe even false. Some people would maybe even go to that extreme to say that the church is false if the pastor doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon. And guys, don't get me wrong. I think it's a total shame. I think it's an atrocity that most pastors in most churches have swept this topic of deliverance under the rug. I totally realize and affirm that and don't want to take away from that whatsoever. It's a really sad thing, most definitely. And I even think that there's going to be accountability for it on the day of judgment with many leaders in the church as to why they didn't interact with deliverance. Many different supernatural things, but particularly deliverance. Now, what you could do is you could interpret certain passages in a very hyper-literal way, like, well, Brother Noah, doesn't Mark chapter 16, verse 17 say, "These signs shall follow those who believe. They will cast out demons, they'll speak in new tongues, they'll lay hands on the sick and see them healed," etc. But I think that's a giant leap to say, if a Christian or if a pastor doesn't believe that a Christian can have a demon, that disqualifies them from Mark 16:17. And I don't believe Mark 16:17 should even be interpreted in a very hyper-literal way. Like, are you really going to interpret that as like, if somebody hasn't gone through a checklist of speaking in tongues, casting out demons, laying hands on the sick, that means they're a false Christian? Even the preceding statements of like, they shall take up, deadly serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not harm them. Even those statements, could have various different interpretations. So obviously we shouldn't take that verse in a very hyper-literal way. And if you want to take it in a very hyper-literal way, were you not saved up until you cast out demons? Then you're really veering off into the weeds if that's the kind of approach that you want to take on the topic. Another thing is, there's multiple other points that I want to touch on actually, but you could go to a church and radically feel the presence of God. You could go to a church and feel not even just like feel the presence of God, but encounter God. And the ministry is actually facilitating that experience in a real, tangible way. God's not just like happening to encounter you there, but that is a place where the Lord is visiting people reoccurringly time and time again. But the pastor, doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon. That happens in so many churches, guys. Are you going to write off all those churches as false because a pastor says a Christian can't have a demon? And guys, this is coming from me, where the Lord has called me as one of the major parts of my ministry to tell people that Christians can have demons. I've explained this over and over and over again, and I will continue by the grace of God to explain it over and over again, guys. But once again, you go to churches, can you write it off as false? Now, one thing you could say is God is leading me to another church. I'll say this, guys. Now I'll go to the other end of the conversation. If there's a church in your area where they're actively doing deliverance and you're at a different church, why are you still at that church? No, I'm just kidding. In some sense. But yes, definitely. If there's a better alternative where there is a church that is doing deliverance, then I would probably recommend in most cases, rather go to that church. If there was a church in my hometown, for example, that was doing deliverance actively, I would up and leave the church that I'm going to pretty much in a heartbeat and go to that church, right? So take this all into consideration, guys. Don't let your passion for deliverance become, zeal that is mishandled, zeal that is militaristic in nature when it doesn't need to be militaristic in nature. And ask yourself this question as well too. Is the pastor just kind of ignorant of deliverance, or is the pastor actively attacking deliverance? Now, if the pastor is getting up and preaching sermons that's like, blasphemous, that's like, degrading the ministry of deliverance in a direct way, then I wouldn't even sit through that sermon. I would stand up and get out of that church. I maybe even say something out loud against the sermon, depending on the context. But I would not, I wouldn't even stay through the sermon if that was going on. But if they're just showing their ignorance, I was just talking to somebody about this morning on email. If they're just simply showing their ignorance of deliverance in the way that they speak, you can't say that church is false. And you also can't make like a total binding statement. If your church doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon, leave that church. You don't know where the pastor's at in their walk and their understanding of spiritual things. Maybe they're actively growing in that area. You don't know where that Christian is at as well too. What if a new convert reads that statement that says if your pastor doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon, and they leave their church, and now what? A lot of people don't have a better alternative, right? A lot of people don't have a better alternative where a church is actively casting out demons. And guys, I believe demons should be cast out. If and when, God willing, I become a pastor of a church, I would want to be casting out demons by the grace of God, God willing, every week. Like, I would want to be doing deliverance prayer in some capacity. And here's another scenario as well too. A lot of churches might actually do deliverance one-on-one with people, but they don't do deliverance in the church service, right? And you could look at that at face value and be like, oh, they're not casting out demons here. This church is no good. But in actuality, that really shouldn't be the entire basis of the conversation to begin with. And in actuality, they could, I definitely know churches. I definitely know ministries where, they might not actively cast out demons in the middle, right after the sermon, and do mass deliverance on everyone, but they're still actively casting out demons in different settings. Is that still even ideal? No. Guys, there's a lot of things that are ideal about a church. There's a lot of things that are ideal about Christianity, but what does the Bible say? To show long suffering, bearing with one another in the faith until we all come to the maturity in the faith, right, guys? This is what it means to show long suffering. This is what it means to show endurance and patience and, loving people in some senses. If they're not on the same level of spiritual maturity of them, that they are of you, or spiritual understanding in certain areas, it doesn't mean that you just write them off altogether. It doesn't mean that you write them off altogether. And like I said, if you just make that as a blanket statement, leave your church if a pastor doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon. Guys, did you know there's actually some deliverance ministers? I can't really think of a lot of examples. I'm just thinking of one off the top of my head. But who isn't, I'm thinking of more now. People that actively do deliverance ministry that teach a Christian can't have a demon. So now how do you deal with that scenario as well too? I know some pastors, some ministers that have actively taught or do actively teach a Christian can't have a demon, but yet they're casting demons out of Christians. That's pretty weird to me. I don't see how it doesn't click in your mind. Hey, I'm casting demons out of all these people. God is sending me these people because these are his people that need deliverance. Nevertheless, I don't want to go down that discussion route right now, but I just want to show depth and complexity to the conversation, to the discussion, that you can't just write it off as like, oh, they don't affirm that statement in a hyper-literal way. They might still actively do a deliverance. Or maybe God is going to use you. Maybe God, is actively trying to open their mind to the reality of deliverance. Now, with a lot of pastors, probably not so much in actuality. They're probably still bound up by tradition of man. With regard, or they just have fear of doing deliverance in front of the church. And once again, that doesn't mean that that's a giant leap to say that the church is no good for any Christian. And maybe for one Christian, God isn't leading them to go to that church because of that. But maybe for another Christian, that's not the case, guys. With this kind of discussion, it's not a one size fits all. It's most definitely not a one size fits all. Let's say there's one new convert who's heavily demonized, and God is actively telling them to leave a church where they're not getting deliverance so they can go find a church where they could get deliverance, right? But for somebody else, they still need deliverance, but it's not as much of a necessity in their life, right? And they need some kind of other ministry more in that current season of their life. Now, you guys know who follow my ministry, I teach everybody needs deliverance. And I believe deliverance is an ongoing thing, ideally for every Christian. But once again, there's depth and complexity to this situation. And there's plenty, it's going to come across very militaristic, very isolationist if you teach just blanket a Christian. If a pastor doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon, leave that church. You know what you're going to find amongst people who have a very black and white binary mentality like that? They're very isolated, like they can't keep relationships. Guys, you don't want to fall down this trap. A lot of Christians might fall down this trap where eventually, you're going to find something you disagree pretty passionately with about in every Christian. This is my experience, guys, that at some point or another, there's something where it's like, wow, I really disagree with that Christian on this topic right now. But if you allow that to be a hill to die on, every topic, you're going to isolate yourself from everybody. And once again, what's the better alternative? If you're saying right here, oh, Noah, if a pastor doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon, no, they're compromising, you got to leave that church. Okay, sure. But leave that church to what? To go where? What's the better alternative? That's the thing about a Pharisaical mindset, is it tells people don't do X, Y, or Z, but it never provides the alternative, A, B, and C, of the better alternative of the way to go about. You're not effectively ministering to people. You're not effectively reaching people if you only tell them the direction they can't go, but you don't provide them the solution of the direction that they should go, right? And sometimes you just got to tell people line upon line, precept upon precept, don't do this, don't do that. Teach them in a very simplistic way. But nevertheless, if you're always just saying what you're against, what you're not for, and never what you are for, that can become a slippery slope. That can become dangerous, guys. So I don't want to deviate from the major topic right here. But guys, it's not inherently the case that if a pastor doesn't believe a Christian can have a demon, and there's depth to the deliverance as well too, right? Like I said, did you factor in this discussion that there's some ministers who actively do deliverance on Christians reoccurringly, but they don't even realize it? To me, that's crazy. To me, that's like irrational. Like, how don't you understand a Christian can have a demon when you're doing deliverance on Christians over and over again? It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to me. Once again, I'll say that. But, am I gonna write them off? Am I gonna write them off? No, I think that's a giant leap in that situation, right? So, yeah, guys, I hope you get it. Really take into consideration. Are you cutting yourself off from potentially a really good thing, a church that you're a part of? Think about also if you have children. If you have children and you're not actively, fellowshipping with other Christians, that's not necessarily putting the best example in front of them of like they have no exposure to being in a congregation with Christians. And guys, please don't put in the chat section or in the comment section, no, a church isn't a building, it's a congregation of believers. Well, that's a false dichotomy because it's both. It is a physical building. Christians met in physical buildings and synagogues. And it is also obviously in reference, I would say primarily, yes, to the called out ones, the ecclesia, the body of believers, right? I hope you guys aren't putting in the comment section that simplistic of an argument of the church isn't a building. Well, yes, the church isn't a building, but Christians need somewhere to gather. And usually where people gather is inside of a building. You could gather in a park, but then you got unbelievers around, and eventually you're going to find yourself in a building if you're meeting together with other Christians, whether it's a home or it's a church building. I don't want to deviate into this conversation either too much, guys, but it's awesome that we have specific buildings set aside to where we can worship God. It's like, yeah, you can worship God in a home, but in our society, in our modern day and age, there's physical buildings that have been built that where you can worship God with other Christians without climate and other people influencing you and affecting you. Now, the traditions of man, the false converts, the wicked people that might be in those church, that's a whole nother discussion though, right? That's not an inherent condemnation of a physical church building. But yeah, guys, I just want to say, like, okay, maybe God is leading you to leave a church, but maybe it's not exclusively for the fact that they believe a Christian can't have a demon. It's probably greater than that if you really peel back the discussion. And maybe God is leading you to leave, but I just wanted to bring some depth. And I simply just wanted to make this video to open your heart to the reality of, hey, this is not a simplistic discussion. This is definitely not a simplistic discussion of just like a yes or no. You need to take into consideration, once again, where the Christian's at in their walk, where the church is at, where the pastor's at in their understanding of spiritual things, right? So on and so forth. So on and so forth, guys. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I totally acknowledge there's a lot of false converts in churches. There's a lot of churches that are compromised, and a lot of churches in Western civilization are just a joke. They're not even real churches. They're not even real churches. But to make the leap to say, if I haven't heard this pastor actively give a message on why a Christian can have a demon, that they are therefore to be grouped in with false compromised churches, that's a big leap. And when I say a leap, guys, I mean there's logical disconnects in your arguments. You've went from step 1 and 2 all the way to step 7 before you even made a logical connect with step 3, 4, 5, and 6 before you jumped all the way to 7, right? So anyways, guys, God bless you in Jesus' name. Don't have any inherent animosity towards your pastor and bitterness towards your pastor if they're not actively casting out demons on Sunday or whenever your church fellowships together and congregates. Guys, and I just want to reaffirm this. It breaks my heart that pastors don't do deliverance. Imagine where the church collectively would be if pastors did deliverance. That would be absolutely amazing, right? But once again, we live in the real world. And if that's not a reality, we can't just isolate ourselves and cut ourselves off from people if that's not a reality. And guys, like, I hope you get my heart. Like, there's times where I'm in churches and I'm like, man, think of all the people that could get deliverance right now if the pastor did deliverance. I actively think about that, guys, and it actively tugs on my heart. It really does. But once again, we live in the world that we live in. We live in the state that we live in, and we need to deal with what is at hand, okay? So God bless you guys in Jesus' holy name. If God's leading you to leave a church, great. But I just wanted to give a little depth to the conversation and hopefully bring a little bit of balance back into this deliverance topic, right? So God bless you guys in Jesus Christ's holy name. I'll talk to you all next time.